There was a young single mother of two boys who had been struggling to corral her boys for months. One Sunday at church, the boys would just not sit still. Their mother had tried everything to get them to listen. She had tried punishments, she had tried flicks to the back of the head, she had even tried bribery, and none of it worked. Some of you parents have been there before, I know you have. After a particularly disruptive Sunday morning outburst, she brought the boys by the church, hoping that the pastor would, quote, put the fear of God into them. I hate that phrase, but you say it sometimes, don't you? Starting with the oldest, the pastor met with the boys individually. He set David, the oldest, down and said, "David, where is God?" You see, the pastor was hoping to teach the boy that God was always with him, that God was always watching him, and was in fact saddened by the way he'd been treating his mother and the way he acted during church. David didn't answer the pastor's question. He asked again with some more firmness in his voice, "David, where is God?" This time, David began to squirm in his seat. His face was turning red and his eyes were filled with tears. The pastor asked one more time, "David, where is God?" David was convinced that he was in big trouble. He jumped up from his seat and burst out of the pastor's office, out into the foyer. He sprinted past his mother and brother, and he ran out onto the sidewalk and sped home up the street as quickly as he could as his little feet would carry him. He crashed through the front door, and he ran straight up to his bedroom, ran to the closet, opened the door, threw it shut, barricaded himself in, and hid behind the clothes because he knew he was in trouble. His mother, perplexed, apologized to the minister and took little Jimmy home, but as soon as they got out onto the sidewalk, Jimmy tore it from her hands and ran home himself, looked for his brother and found him in the upstairs bedroom. And when he opened the closet door, he said, "Big brother, what's wrong? What happened?" And he said, "Jimmy, God is missing and they think we've done it." Church, do you ever feel like God is missing? Now, I'm not saying that God has disappeared or that he's gone anywhere, but do you ever feel like in your life, in your relationship, in your faith, that God is missing? Does your life feel blasé or boring, downright uninspired? I think many Christians are stuck in this place where they know what they believe and why they believe it, but there just doesn't seem to be any passion or excitement in their faith. In fact, I would go so far to say that there are many churches that are stuck in this same place. Many churches that lack passion and excitement. They suffer from this same malady. They're full of good people and well-meaning leadership, great church boards and great pastors, but at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like anything is actually happening. They hold revivals and they announce new Sunday school classes, but the same 20 people show up for everything. And guess what? Those 20 people, they're all exhausted. I call these the doers. They do everything in the church. Churches, including ours, are full of doers who will literally do anything that the church or the pastor puts on. Any ministry, any Sunday school class, any church service, they are there and they're probably helping mix the country time yellow or pink lemonade. Why does it seem that every church on the planet uses the same two kinds of lemonade? It's weird. One of those weird church things. These doers, they feel obligated to be there. They have to do everything that the church asks, or else they feel as though they're being sinful. Maybe you're like this. I think this way of thinking found its roots in fundamentalism. In the 1950s and 1960s, it creeped into the Church of the Nazarene. During this era, many of our churches became influenced by more traditional, more fundamental, and more theologically conservative denominations than ourselves. You see, following God became about being in church whenever the doors were open and following all the rules. Some of you know these rules and you've lived by them. You came through this era. Rules like you had to wear a bun in your hair and no makeup. Men, you had to wear a suit and a tie. You had to volunteer for every event, etc., etc. And I believe this has a direct correlation with the lack of passion and excitement for the mission of God that we see in many Christians and churches today. People replace the leading of the Holy Spirit and holiness with a focus on doing enough to feel holy and look holy to others in the church. In Matthew 22, Jesus talks about some of these doers, people who thought you had to do certain things to be holy or look holy to others. The author, Matthew, identifies three groups to which Jesus was speaking that day: the chief priests, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the crowd of onlookers. They were curious about who Jesus was, and they identified him as a prophet of God. In Matthew 21, at the very end, you see the Pharisees and Sadducees were upset with Jesus. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But Matthew says that the Pharisees and Sadducees knew they couldn't trap Jesus. They couldn't make Jesus look bad because the crowd believed he was a prophet of God. You know, this prophet, it's interesting because Palm Sunday has already occurred. Jesus has already come into Jerusalem, and the hallelujahs or hosannas and laying the tunics, the coats across the path as he came in. That's already occurred, and yet the crowd still thinks of him as a prophet and not necessarily the Son of God. You see, these Pharisees and Sadducees, they were doers, and they were doers because it was their job to keep the faith. You may remember that there was a period of roughly 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. This was known as the intertestamental period. During this time, there were some extra biblical works, things that you'll find in the Catholic Bible, but for the most part, there were not any prophets or any amazing action taken by God during this time, at least that was deemed worthy to be put into the Bible today. And these Pharisees, it was their job to maintain the Word of God. It was extremely important that as keepers of the faith, that the Pharisees, Sadducees, and chief priests did just that, keep the faith. In order to do so, they developed a list of rules, laws, sacrificial practices, and the like that had to be adhered to by any follower of Yahweh. This is how they maintained their faith. This is how they kept orthodox belief. The problem is that in their doing of their faith, they had lost sight of what it meant to truly follow after God. Their faith became about religion, and it was no longer faith. When Jesus came along and rewrote the script, so to speak, they were left scrambling. The religious leaders liked things the way that they were and didn't want anything to change because they were comfortable and used to being in charge. The average person in the crowd, however, probably found it impossible to keep all of the rules that they had made. You know, there were 613 different rules within the Torah. So Jesus he taught them that following God should be less about religion and more about faith. And that really struck a chord. If we read Matthew 21 and 22, we'll find that for the crowd, they really enjoyed this, but the religious leaders, Pharisees and Sadducees, they hated it because they could see their power, their influence slipping away. And so they devised these different plans to try and stick Jesus, to grill him, essentially. And you can find these all throughout 21 and 22 here in Matthew. And I encourage you to read these chapters on your own, but we're specifically focusing on Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. It says this: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them was an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second greatest is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." The Pharisees knew that Jesus hadn't totally discounted their laws. In fact, Jesus said in Matthew 5:17, "I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." So they tried to confuse and catch Jesus in a mistake. But Jesus gives the all-time greatest shade-casting moment here. Rather than falling into their trap, it's almost as if he says, hold up. Do you knuckleheads really think that I'm going to name one of these other rules or laws as greater than any other? I see what you're trying to do here, and I'm going to answer your question with a powerful statement. The most important thing you could possibly do is love God with everything that you've got, with all your heart, soul, mind, whatever. Everything that you have to love God. And I know that you're about to ask, okay, Jesus, if that's the most important, what's the second most important? So let me go ahead and tell you. It's this, that you need to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. You need to love them as much as you love yourself. And I'll tell you that these are the most important things you can do. I mean, isn't that convicting today, church? Today, church, this is Jesus' command to us, too. Anything that we do as a church must be based on these two commandments, from worship to preaching, greeting to custodial, running sound to stocking the food pantry, answering telephones to shoveling sidewalks. By the way, that's coming a lot faster than y'all imagine it is. It's going to be snow right around the corner. Whether you're changing a dirty diaper in the nursery or singing on the praise team, all of these things should exemplify love for God and love for others. Our actions and the things that we spend our time doing lose their meaning when they're disconnected from the love of God and love of others. Consider this battery-powered drill I brought with me today. This drill, it's a resource, right? It is powered. It has the battery power connected to it. And you need the battery to make it work. When you take a drill like this and you disconnect it from the battery, it's not good for much. Maybe you can still do a few things with it. You could probably try and stick it in a screw and or you could use it like a hammer, I guess. But it lost all of its power. When you connect to the drill, it is now a resource that is sourced from its power, right? And it works great now. It has power. It serves a good purpose. And you know what? People in the church, when they're just doing things to do them, it's as if they're a drill disconnected from the power. When we just go through the motions of church, and we're not actually doing it because we love God or we want to love others well, we're just doing it because it's what we're supposed to do, that's like being disconnected from God. So when we're connected, when our church is connected, when we are doing the things we're doing because we love God and love others, it has true power behind it. It has actual power behind it. This drill, it's like the Pharisees. They were disconnected from God. Everything was about religion for them. And so they had lost their source of power. They lost their source of power. And so Jesus is trying to reconnect them with that by saying, look, all these rules, everything that you're trying to do, at the end of the day, what really matters is love me and love others. That's all that you really have to be focused on. And all these other rules and commandments, they're all pinned into this one. Everything else, do because you love God and love others, not because it's a rule that you're supposed to follow. So today, church, we often miss the point of doing worship, doing preaching, volunteering in the worship team, helping with VBS. We serve the homeless, and we're doing them not because it's what we feel like it exemplifies the love of God, but it's what we're supposed to do, and it's what the pastor asked me to do. You know, when we moved here, a number of you said, Pastor, we're really hoping that you would help our church get younger. And I thought, that's interesting, because what we really want to focus on, sure, we want to get younger, but what we really want to focus on is loving God and loving others. It's not about do this, do that. It's about love God and love others. So how are we going to fix this in our church? The first is this. We have to love God with all of our hearts. And we're going to achieve that with 3 steps. Honesty before God, honesty before others, and accountability with our peers. Today I want to ask you to look deep into the mirror. I'm asking the same questions of myself. Do my choices with my time reflect my love for God and for others? Am I more worried about being filled up every Sunday or with growing closer to God? Am I more worried about the homeless person, the single mother, and the addict than I am about having my own needs met? We have to get real, church. Jesus was challenging the Pharisees by essentially saying to them, you're more worried about your own rules and your own power and your own stuff than you are about loving God. Church, do we love God enough to listen to worship that isn't in our style preference? Contemporary or Southern gospel or hymns or whatever? Are we more concerned with the color of the carpet than we are with the lost who live just down the street from our church? We have to ask ourselves these hard questions. Here's the thing. I bet many of you have had God correct your spirit in regards to this in the past. He's probably brought these questions to your mind. You've probably even prayed a prayer asking for forgiveness. I believe wholeheartedly that one of Satan's most dangerous weapons against a believer and the church today is isolation. If a personal revelation happens in your relationship with God and you keep it to yourself, then you will have a harder time staying accountable to that commitment. So today, I'm mentioning a few things that are going to be vision casting things in the future that we're going to do here at Roanoke First. And one of those is this, that we are going to commit to a new mission at Roanoke First, that is to have every single person who attends our church regularly to be engaged in a small group, a mentorship relationship, or a discipleship relationship. These are important because they guide each other closer to God, and they hold us accountable. This is where you come in, though. If you're interested in leading a small group, would you please talk with me or with Cindy Wheeler, who's going to be our small group coordinator. Additionally, we are implementing a new small group model that is geared for growth both spiritually and numerically. In 3 years, we hope to see at least half of our groups split into 2 new groups, opening up spots for new people to engage in small groups. The overall purpose of all this is not just to add something else to your schedule, something for you to do, but to provide an environment that will change you personally in your relationship with God, while also being with others who can hold you accountable in that. You see, it's about growing spiritually, but also in this process, people will be drawn to our church and to discipleship. They'll be closer to God and will grow in number as well. Jesus' second greatest commandment that he gave to the Pharisees was to love your neighbor as yourself. He knew that the Pharisees had a high view of themselves, that they were more concerned with their own power and success than they were with their own neighbors. The marginalized in their society were considered outcasts by these religious leaders. They called lepers unclean, and they forced them to leave their families and homes and jobs to live outside of the city walls. If isolation is one of Satan's most dangerous weapons, then self-concern is his second most dangerous weapon. So many religious people are more focused on their own sin, their own problems, and their own circumstances that they fail to serve others in any way. You see, Satan wants to convince you that your stuff is worse than anybody else's. And if you're focused just on you and your problems, then you're going to miss all the opportunities that God has put in front of you to help others. We come to church because we think we need to be encouraged. And if this is our mindset, that this is for us, if we're always chasing spiritual happiness, then we're going to find out the hard way that we're never going to actually reach it. We're never going to actually reach happiness because we're focused on ourselves. We're focused on me and what I need and what I want. The way to true joy is not through being filled up every Sunday, but by loving others as much as you love yourself. Philippians 4:19 says that God will meet all of our needs according to the riches of the glory of Christ Jesus. What we need, according to Paul, is Jesus. But when we're so focused on our own problems, we miss out on the blessings of grace that God has for us. So how do we fix this? We have to turn our gaze outward. And that's the second part of our vision here at Roanoke First. Our church is right in the middle of a mission field. Did you know that every time you come to church, you drive past the homes of single mothers, of drug addicts, of abusers, and the abused? You drive right by the home of the LGBTQ. You drive right by the home of those who have been burned by the church. You drive by the hungry and the lost. In fact, right in the alley behind my house, there are several homeless people that live. right back there. That God, forgive us for being more worried about our own needs and the survival of our own church, and in the process, ignoring those of others who we pass literally along the way. The second major step we're taking to truly love God and love others is to serve. Each of the aforementioned small groups will participate in service opportunities in their communities every month. Now, I know that may seem like a lot. Every month, well, these could be outreach events and services that the church offers. You could get involved with the daycare and volunteer, serve a meal or something like that. Or each of the small groups could find their own efforts, volunteering in a soup kitchen, maybe finding a neighbor who needs some help with things around the house, or maybe there's somebody you know that owns a shop and you're going to go and help them sweep and mop all the floors in their shop all night. I don't know. But the goal with these groups is not just to serve others. It's with the express purpose of illustrating God's love for those who, by illustrating God's love for all of those, and we have the privilege of serving them. And we know that if we do this, if we love others with the love of God, then we are participating in the prevenient grace. We're participating in the love of God for that person, which will ultimately draw that person closer to God themselves. Listen, church, our vision is simple. Love God by growing closer to each other and God in the context of biblical learning and accountability in a small group. And love others by serving them with that small group. The challenge is to actually buy in. I know many of you right now are feeling fired up and convicted by this sermon, but 6 months from now, attending small group will become a chore for you. You'll cancel these service opportunities because the members of your group are too busy. So here's what we're going to do, church. We are going to celebrate those victories. Every other month, we are going to hold a Love God, Love Others Sunday, in which we're going to highlight all of the ministries, all of the activities that are taking place, everything that every small group has done to love God and love others. We're going to share stories of spiritual growth, and we're going to share stories of service opportunities and the way that God used those things, because I know that through those opportunities of serving others, He's going to give us a chance to share the